To see so many of you. It is just always a joy to be able to spend time with other human beings in a big room and listen to a talk. I think this has been great. I had missed it so much over the months of the pandemic, and was so grateful that we were able to get back into the classroom at least halfway through the quarter this year. And I'm so looking forward to next quarter when we'll be able to perhaps even remove our masks when we feel comfortable doing so. But on that note, we have been asked to at least keep them on for another couple days before we take them off. And we want everyone to be comfortable and to feel safe in this environment. So before I begin too, I just want you to please look around and see the exits. You see the exits, left on the right, left and right. And then there's also a restroom back there. I'm also going to invite all of you. My students know what I'm about to ask. What am I about to ask?
The ritual.
Turn off your cell phones. There you go. Or at least put them on silent, please. My students, this is known as the ritual. I also want to let you know that we have a representative from UC Davis Police is here in case there's any issues or people need any additional assistance as well. So, it is my pleasure, as Director of the University of California, Davis Human Rights Studies Program, to welcome you to the inaugural Shant and Garabedian Lecture in Genocide and Mass Atrocity Studies. As we begin, and especially with the subject of today's talk in mind, I would like to read the following. We should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Kachil Dehe, Band of Wintun Indians of the Colosa Indian Community, Tletzel Dehe Wintun Nation, and Yocha Dehe Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. Today's lecture is only possible because of the generosity of the, we're recording, correct? All right? This point is very important right now. Today's lecture is only possible because of the generosity of the whole Garabedian family, who unfortunately weren't able to join us this year, but I hope will be able to come next year. Their gift has made this event possible and reflects, in part, Dr. Shant Garabedian's belief in UC Davis and what we are doing in human rights studies to build the next generation of California's human rights leaders. He's an advocate, like most of you in this room. He came to UC Davis from a war-torn Lebanon to earn his bachelor's degree. He then went on to become an emergency room doctor and has been on the front lines of the pandemic for the last 2 years. We are sharing this event with the family, so please join me in a round of applause, thanking them for their support. Before I introduce Dean Estela Atacuagna, let me use this moment to share 2 things. First, the Human Rights Studies Program Committee has decided, with the incredible success of the Human Rights Studies minor and the course of study in mind, that we will begin next quarter the process of establishing the first Human Rights Studies major in the University of California system. Every time I say that, I think it's going to be tough. It will be a steep climb for my colleagues and me as we work through the various steps and levels of bureaucracy. I just heard that. All right. For our university to effectively respond to today's human rights challenges and problems, it must be and will be done. And to do so, we need your support. Our goal is to have this major in place so that a student entering this fall will be able to graduate in 2026 with the degree. Second, I am inspired in this work by my students and colleagues every day, as well as by the example of someone very important to us in human rights studies, Benjamin Ferencz. My students know who he is, who turns 102 years old today. As a young man, Ferencz was a soldier who liberated several Nazi death camps during the waning days of World War II, who then went on to prosecute Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. On the last day of class, our students often listened to an interview he gave in the early 2000s as a kind of valediction, call to action. Let me just read you a brief passage from that. When I went to school, there was no such thing as human rights law. Humanitarian law didn't exist. I knew the man who invented it, René Cassin. He won a Nobel Prize for that. There was no such thing as genocide, the crime of genocide. Nobody had ever heard the word. I knew Raphael Lemkin, the man who invented that. So I've seen these changes coming in our lifetime. It's a long life. I'm in my 87th year, but it is very short. It's a blink in the eye of time. We need several generations to continue working on it, and I hope someday someone will pick up this torch when it slips from my hand, which may be very soon, which apparently it has not been. So, he concludes, so it can be done, and we should never be defeatist and say that it can't be done. It is so obviously correct that law is better than war, and that it is better to live in peace with human rights than to live in war, killing people whom you don't even know. So, Dean Estela Ataguana, it is such a pleasure that you have joined us today. Dean Ataguana is new to us here at UC Davis and has taken on the great challenge of serving as our Dean of the College of Letters and Sciences, the largest college at UC Davis, overseeing the divisions of social sciences, humanities, arts, and cultural studies, and mathematical and physical sciences. Born in Cameroon, a country facing very real human rights challenges around cultural and linguistic rights, she's a renowned geophysicist and previously served as the Dean at the University of Delaware's College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment. She is a recipient of Outstanding Educator Awards from the Association of Women Geoscientists and the Society of Exploration Geophysicists, which must be a very fun club to be in. Please join me in welcoming Dean Ataguana, not just today, to here, but to UC Davis.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Hopefully everyone can hear me well. I'm really pleased to be here and to welcome you to the first Dr. Shant and Rodin Garabedian lecture in Genocide and Mass Violence presented by our college's interdepartmental program in human rights studies. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Estela Ataguana and I serve as the current Dean of the College of Letters and Science. And as Professor Wanwa has said, I recently joined the college in 2021. I am truly excited to be here at UC Davis and also at this particular event. I keep saying UC Davis is a phenomenal university. For those who don't know, it is. It truly is. I think we do not sing our praises loud enough. And that is something that I hope to be able to change in my position as the Dean. I also want to say that I lead a phenomenal college. And I truly want to salute our amazing faculty. And as you heard from the students this afternoon, it really reinforces in me the value of a liberal arts education. That students can follow their passions and still be able to do those things that they like to do in terms of career options. That's a value that I think a College of Letters and Sciences offers our students all across this campus. So today's discussion couldn't be more timely. I'm sure that many of you, like me, have closely followed the news coming from the recent invasion in Ukraine and are thinking of all those affected, both here and abroad. And as members of a global society, we know all too well that war and conflict leave deep scars across generations. And for somebody like myself, coming from Cameroon, that currently has a struggle going on, and the part of Cameroon that is struggling is actually where I was born. And so we have a lot of internally displaced people. I see the value of the work that the Human Rights Program here at UCD does. The Armenian genocide, when 1 million Armenians were killed between 1914 and 1920, is just one example of the long-felt impacts of war. Our speaker today, the writer Mark Arax, will reflect on his own experience as a Californian and a descendant of Armenian genocide survivors. His books combine history, biography, memoir, and reporting to bring us a unique and critical view on how violence has shaped our state and its people. I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you, Mark, for sharing your knowledge with us today. I'd also like to thank Shant and Robin Garabedian for their support of Armenian American students at UC Davis and of the college's Human Rights Program. Dr. Garabedian is also a descendant of the Armenian genocide and spent his early years in Beirut, Lebanon, where his maternal grandmother was taken in by an orphanage after escaping Turkey. In fact, he grew up across the street from our own Hegna Zitlian Wadenbaum, a professor of art history and Guggenheim Fellow, who is an international leader in the study of genocide and the discussion of cultural heritage. Dr. Garabedian and his family moved to San Francisco when he was 15. As a UC Davis student, he and his friends founded the Armenian Student Association to bring attention to the genocide. We are so grateful to you and Robin for your support of this lecture series, which will ensure that the historical and contemporary experiences of Armenians continue to be heard at UC Davis. Before I wrap up, I must also thank Professor Keith David Wattenpa, and I need to say Keith because there's another Wattenpa in the audience. And being somebody that also has a double name with my husband, I have to clarify that, for organizing this lecture series. Professor Wattenpa is the director of our Human Rights Program, which prepares California's next generation of human rights leaders. In the last 6 years, this program, the largest of its kind in California, has grown from just a handful of classes into a comprehensive curriculum, serving over 1,000 students each year. This is truly impressive. I can only imagine what Professor Wattenpa and his human rights studies colleagues will accomplish in the future. Professor Wattenpa also leads the Article 26 Backpack Project to help displaced students, whether they are fleeing the violence in Ukraine or affected by the earthquake in Haiti, start or continue their university education even if they are on the move. UC Davis has a vision to be the first in the nation to bring the full force of a public research university to bear on critical human rights issues, and Keith is an international leader in spearheading collaborative, sustainable responses to urgent human rights challenges. Thank you so much for your tireless effort and work in this front. And with that, I would like to turn the program over back to you, Keith. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for those very kind words. Thank you for those very kind words. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Professor of Spanish and Human Rights Studies, Michael Rosara, who also serves as Associate Vice Provost of Global Affairs. Michael will introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you so much, Professor Wattenpa, and thanks to Dean Atakwana for joining us today. And it's also wonderful to be with all of you and here in person, and to have this opportunity and honor to introduce our distinguished speaker, author Mark Arax. Mark Arax has been called a 21st century John Steinbeck for his books that pry open the soul of California. A writer of essays, history, biography, and journalism, he's a two-time winner of the California Book Award and a recipient of Stanford University's William Saroyan International Prize for Writing. His books delve deeply into the soul of California, its land, its people, and a culture of extraction that defines the West. No writer has devoted more pages to the story of California agriculture, small farmers and big farmers, the migrants who toiled to bring home the crops, than Arax. A son of the San Joaquin Valley with family roots in farming, he earned his master's degree in journalism from Columbia University and began his journalism career at the Baltimore Evening Sun before returning home to write for the LA Times. He quickly distinguished himself as one of those rare journalists who combined the tenacity of an investigative reporter and the pen of a poet. His work in the late 90s and early 2000s revealed that state-sanctioned murder was happening in California prisons and being covered up at the highest levels. His relentless pursuit of the truth, hailed by the nation as, quote, one of the great journalistic achievements of the decade, forced California to stop its practice of mixing rival inmates in tiny exercise yards and then shooting them dead when they fought. His first book, called In My Father's Name, is a stirring memoir that weaves the history of his Armenian family and their journey out of genocide with the corruption of Fresno, his hometown. It tells of his decades-long search to find the men who murdered his father. His second book, called The King of California, a bestseller co-authored with Rick Wartzman, tells the epic story of the Boswell cotton-growing family and how they brought the plantation south into the heart of California. His most recent work, The Drecked Land, Chasing Water and Dust Across California, also a national bestseller, has been hailed by critics as one of the most important books ever written about the U.S. West. For 5 years, Arax traveled up and down the state to explore the one-of-a-kind water delivery system that we have, built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and that's straining to keep up with California's growth. Here in the arid West, where migrant workers are left to work in the sun, water is extracted from the fatigued earth so that farmers can plant more nuts and developers build more houses. Here at UC Davis, of course, we teach about environmental justice, migration, indigenous rights, and other topics on which Mark has much to say. We also teach hundreds of students every year about genocide and the battles over memory that happen both globally and locally. Today, Mark will tackle these urgent topics so close to home in his talk titled, The Lost Tribes of the Great Valley, Genocide and the Landscapes of Memory in California. I give you Mark Arax.
Can I hold the mic?
Sure. Yeah, you're going to hold that one?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's, well, I gotta turn this baby off.
Griffin, thank you for being here. Dean, I appreciate you being here as well. Keith, Egnar, your hospitality over the past few days has been extraordinary. Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you to all you gathering here. This is the first time I've been public in about a couple of years. And if I'm a little rusty, I'm going to use that as an excuse. I also came down, not with COVID, I got tested like 5 times, but I did come down with allergies, which I've never had in my life, and which I'm going to blame on the 1.6 million acres of almonds that we planted in the state of California. What's extraordinary is that 660,000 of these almonds and pistachios have been planted in the last 10 years alone, which is the driest period in the history of California, which says something about farmers and scarcity, which is a book that we don't have to get into right now. I want to also welcome the Garabedians. I'm assuming they may be watching from Tennessee. Thank you for their generosity in underwriting this and future talks like this. The older I become, the more I find myself intrigued by the question of what I actually knew as a child. Or, if the facts themselves eluded me, what I sensed as a child. I'm inclined to say that I was no different than most of you. A kid who grew up mostly dumb to the invention of his place. I'm reasonably certain that I had no idea the forces that brought Fresno, the San Joaquin Valley, California, into being. Like the children of so many other immigrants, migrants, and refugees, neither was I aware of the reinvention of my family. The second act that inevitably grew out of the first act of relocation. When your place of relocation, your place of reinvention, is keenly adept, I would say, at hiding its secrets from you as a way of preserving its mode of operation, even the curious child is deterred in his inquiry. I knew my name was Mark Randy Arax. That Mark and Randy and the pronunciation of Arax, which is actually Arax. I knew that these things did not hold me apart from my classmates, but rather they assisted me in joining the company of my white peers, whose parents and grandparents had come to California from Oklahoma and Arkansas and Texas during the Dust Bowl. I knew that Arax itself was the name of a river in a faraway land that flowed out from a mountain called Ararat. That it wasn't our actual surname, which was Hosepian, but it was a pen name that my grandfather, a would-be poet, had given himself. I knew that Johnny Hosepian had become Aram Arax before he ever arrived at Ellis Island. I knew that my father, Ara, and his brother, Navasart actually, he would tell his classmates to call him John, that they had no interest in becoming poets, writers, or scholars. They invented themselves as athletes who starred in baseball and football. My dad got a football scholarship to USC, and my uncle played for a time in the Pirates professional organization. I knew that my father had left USC to come home to help with the family farm, and he re-enrolled at Fresno State as part of the first class of viticulture students, and then he dropped out. He'd been a grape grower before we sold our last farm along the San Joaquin River. Then he became a grocer. They started a chain, he and his brother started a chain of markets in Fresno called Peacock. And as a kid, I was fascinated at the neon sign that hung outside each of our 5 peacocks. It was a peacock in neon iridescence in full plumage. And one of those stores, not ours anymore, the sign is still standing. I knew that we lost these grocery stores one by one when the chains came in and we couldn't compete. Safeway first. And we were selling so many items that my father and uncle called lost leaders that all the shelves were full of loss leaders and we just couldn't compete. And so one by one, they went bankrupt. And my dad came home one day and told us that he had bought a bar and a restaurant along Highway 99. He fast turned it into the hottest rock and roll joint between LA and Frisco. It was the first integrated nightclub in the San Joaquin Valley. And he did the integration through music. He brought in a group called El Chicano, a group called Ball and Jack. And in the summer of 1971, he brought in Chuck Berry himself. Chuck had gotten out of prison a few years before and had written a new song called My Dingling. And I'll leave that up to your imaginations. And there he was. I wanted to go so badly that night. They actually had 2 shows. They filled up the nightclub and then emptied it out and filled it up again. And there was Chuck Berry doing his famous duck walk across the stage. The father, for those of you who don't know, he was one of the fathers, like Little Richard and others, of rock and roll. I knew that my mother, Flora Mekatarian, the youngest daughter of Yehishe Mekatarian, who was the priest of the Red Brick Church, Armenian Church, in downtown Fresno. And I learned through Sunday school that we were the first Christian people, that as a state, Armenia had adopted Christianity in 301 AD. And I also learned that there was something, I can't even tell you what it is, Egnar would know, but that there was something unique about the way we built our churches. The domes had a certain number of sides. How many were they? 8 sides. That made it unique in architecture. And these were the things that we held on proudly to. I knew that my mom was born in Marseille, France. She ate baguette bread with chocolate in the mornings. And she sang to me, Frère Jacques, Frère Jacques, Frère Jacques, dormez-vous, dormez-vous. Something. Yes. I knew that Sundays were a day of great struggle between my parents and sometimes a fight, because I wanted to stay home and watch the 49ers play on television. And when the 49ers played in Minnesota or somewhere back east, the games came on at 10 in the morning. And this is when we were supposed to be going off to church. And my mom would yell, the daughter of the priest, he has to be in church. He has to be there. His Heidi, his grandfather, will be leading the ceremonies, the liturgy. My dad said, let him stay home. Guess who won? I also knew that from grammar school that I was called a Fresno Indian, which I could never figure out why. This kid who was a Yugoslavian, his family had immigrated just like ours. He started doing a powwow dance one day, chanting woo 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 woo. And I didn't know what to do, so I responded with my fists, and I got in trouble, sent home early. And I asked my father, who had during the day he was home, because he ran a nightclub. He was gone at nights. I said, what's a Fresno Indian? And he had no good answer for me. We had sold the farm and we lived in the suburbs of a place called Fig Garden. And this is a place where irrigation canals knifed through the neighborhood. Now, if you don't think that's weird, it is weird. There aren't many cities where the traffic is stopped by railroads and irrigation canals and ditches. And it never occurred to me to ask as a kid, where did this water come from? Who was it going to? Because it certainly wasn't stopping off in our suburbia. It was just passing by. And wherever it was going to, by what right was it going to that place? These are questions that didn't occur to me but I didn't answer for another 30 years. My grandmother, who was deathly afraid of water, told me never to walk on the irrigation canal itself because vertigo would overtake me and I would fall in. And the patricians that ran Fresno, the agricultural giants, would not stop the flow of the irrigation canal to fish out one silly boy. Reminded me later of the proverb that no plow is stopped for the sake of a dying man. So we had lost our farm, but my grandfather hadn't stopped farming because in his backyard, and there it is, right there. It's my grandfather, and that looks like a pony, and it's supposed to be. It's a myth, right? It's actually a dog, German Shepherd. And there are all his fruits and vegetables. And there's the laundry hanging, and the date, if you look close enough, is April 24th, 1915, which signifies for us the opening of the genocide, when 250 of our leading intellectuals and poets and writers were rounded up and herded into the interior of Turkey, away from Istanbul or Constantinople at the time, so that the outside world couldn't see what was about to happen. So it's a very symbolic tapestry that my aunt Jeanette Arax painted. My grandfather would sometimes take me to these backyard farms, where these farmers, they'd lost their farms during the Depression, but they would grow this profusion of fruits that came out of very small plots. My grandfather had a 25-foot by 25-foot square plot right there in his suburban backyard, and it grew such vegetables. I loved searching for guta. Guta is an Armenian cucumber. And I will tell you that it's the best tasting cucumber in the world. It's got big fat ridges, and it tastes when you don't allow it to get big and rank, because it will turn into a melon if you let it. But if you pick it small, it has a nutty, crispy flavor that's extraordinary. And I would go searching for those. And then one year I remember he planted okra, because we had a dish called bamya, which was made out of okra. And this okra, it started off this small, and then it grew double, and then it grew so high past the roof line that to pick the okra, we had to climb ladders. And as a kid, it wasn't too difficult to imagine this being a real live Jack and the Beanstalk story. And then my grandfather would take me to the backyards of other old Armenian backyard farmers. There was an army of them throughout Fresno. And I remember one who my grandfather competed. They all competed. The size of their tomatoes. And they're men, of course. And it never was about taste, because the smaller tomato tasted better. But my grandfather was a committed organic farmer. In fact, there was a publication called Organic Farming that was published by Rodale's, and they also published a magazine called Prevention. And my grandfather was a reader of this magazine, and when we went to visit other farms, he would silently compare. So I remember this one farmer, his name was Donabed. We went to his backyard, and as soon as I walked in, Donabed started pulling my ears. I mean, he would yank on my ears. This explains my ears. And then he would reach into his pocket and give me a 50-cent piece, as if that was compensation for the headache that I had. So we'd walk in the backyard, and Donabed had a garden that was superior, I had to admit. Far superior. Well, a little bit superior to my grandfather's. My grandfather was silent as we surveyed this. And then when we got back in the car, he said, "That son of a bitch. He's a cheater." I said, "What do you mean, Pop?" Now, Pop grew only with manure and sulfur. He said, that son of a bitch is using Miracle Grow. This is what I knew on the evening of January 2nd, 1972. The day had begun bad when our 49ers lost to the Dallas Cowboys in the playoffs. I was going to go to the bar that night with my father. New Year's, he was going to count the New Year's Eve receipts, and I was going to play billiards. I was a little sharp back then. He gave me a cue that actually unscrewed, so you have to screw it in two, and I had a little carrying case that looked like it had a rifle or some kind of arms in it. But it was a foggy night, that Thule fog that sets down into the valley. And he caught me in the shower. And he said, I remember his voice I could hear, but I couldn't quite see him. The shower door had some designs in it that would allow you to see through. Plus it was the mist and the condensation, the heat of the shower. I couldn't see him, but I could hear him. And he said, I'll be back in an hour. I don't want you coming with me because you will catch your death of cold out there. The Armenians always thought we'd catch pneumonia if we went outside and our hair was wet. He left, and 45 minutes later the phone rang and my mom started screaming, your father's been shot. I grabbed the Bible that I got from Sunday school, and I ran down the block screaming for any neighbors who could hear. And the neighbor down the street, their son was a friend of mine. I knocked on the door, and they drove me back home, picked up my mom, my brother and sister stayed with other neighbors, and we drove to St. Agnes Hospital in the middle of Fresno. I sat there with my Bible, and I saw an elegant black man come out from the emergency room, and I recognized him right off. He was Dr. Fitzalbert Marius, and he was one of my father's very good friends. And Marius had moved next door to us on Tulare Street in Fresno when I was 5. And his daughter April and I would play Marco Polo in the Doughboy pool in our backyard. And when the Mariuses moved to our block, they were the first blacks to move there. And almost the entire block, out of a sign in protest, put up for sale signs. There were only 2 houses in the neighborhood that didn't. Ours and a woman named Rose Sarabian, who was an Armenian nurse. And I didn't quite understand at the time why those 2 Armenian families were unwilling to go along with what the rest of the block did. Dr. Marius came up to me, called me Maki. He came from the East Coast, but he actually came out of the islands. Long, elegant fingers. And he said, I'm sorry, but Ara is dead. Two men from Detroit, it turned out, had walked into his nightclub that night as he was counting the receipts. And they shot him 5 times. He was 40 years old. My mom, they didn't take a dime, by the way. My mom and uncles and aunts had no answer. The police had no answer. I think today that nothing like a hole ripped in the fabric of your narrative, nothing quite like that to inspire a kid to pick up a pen and a paper and a tape recorder and start asking questions. Who was my father? Where had we come from? Where had we come to? What was Fresno? I started that odyssey by asking questions of my 2 grandfathers that no one in the family had ever asked. And I started with the priest, the Aisha Nectarian. And I had my little tape recorder in front of him. And I asked him to tell me about the old country. I'm going to read to you a quote of his that I use in my father's name. I quoted the official Turkish line. The deportations were necessary because the Armenians were revolting and joining forces with Russia, the enemy. He straightened up my tape recorder. And he started this chant. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know where it began, where it would end. And it was Koroshort, Bab Desar, Garabedian, Hagop, Sarkis, Atlas, Konar, Antrani, Khatun, Noyomi, Verkin, Anakas. He went on and on, chanting 42 names. He was the only survivor. They had all died, killed. All of them killed, he said. I don't know how, but God saved me. Why? Only me. Then I went to the poet, Arax, and he told me the story of how he hid in an attic for 2 years with books by Verlaine and Buehler and Maupassant. He had dreams of becoming a writer. And he hid and outlasted the genocide and then came down and went to work at the last surviving Armenian bookstore in Constantinople. And there were hardly anybody left, but these great writers were there trying to find out what words were left to them after this. Every Armenian would-be writer had to have a pen name. My grandfather was 5'4" and 115 pounds, and his first pen name was Aram Aslan. Aslan is a lion. My grandfather didn't quite conjure the image of a lion. But there was something about his prose. Maybe it was muddy and turgid, I don't know. Maybe it flowed like something beautiful. So they named him Arax, after the river, the mother river of a country that didn't exist anymore. My grandfather, when he arrived in the United States, he had a choice. There was an Armenian railroad magnate that was going to send him to the Sorbonne to study. But this uncle had kept writing him letters from Fresno, California. And these letters were full of the myth of California, what we were doing here. This uncle had no one left. He had lost his wife and children. And he had killed the Turk in Bulgaria and then came to Fresno to escape. You must come here. We are starting a new Armenia. The grapes hang from the vines like giant jade eggs. The watermelons, you've never seen watermelons like this. So large that when you scoop out the meat, the shells, you can ride in them. In the irrigation canals and the ditches and even the rivers. So my grandfather had a choice at 19 years old. Paris, France, or Fresno, California. He took the bait. He arrived here, and the uncle dressed up fine to greet him at the depot in Fresno. He had a shiny Model T Ford, and he was dressed to the nines. And there's a photo in this book of the two of them taking a picture together. He let my grandfather kind of wallow in this beauty of Fresno, a land of all these things for about 4 or 5 days. And then he drove him in that Model T Ford. And he said the sound went something like this. Down, up high, down 99, and dropped him off at a place called Weed Patch. Wheat Patch, California. And this is what my grandfather, like all poets in America who come to California, did. He got on his hands and knees and began picking the peppers, potatoes, and other fruits and vegetables in the valley. This might explain why he joined the Communist Party a few years later. He actually took the exam in French to get into Berkeley and went, but ended up, the farm ended up calling him back the same way it later called back my father. But when I began this book in my father's name, one of the things I did was my grandfather was 90 and he was deep into senility. And I said, Pop, we have to write the FBI to get your file. And he said, okay. So I wrote a letter and he was able to sign it. 6 months passed, a year passed, he died. And about 2 years later, a big box arrived. My mother called me. She goes, Mark, a big box has arrived from the Department of Justice. What do I do? And I had to think for a second. I said, Grandma, don't open it. Okay. It was Grandpa's FBI file. The FBI had followed him for a half a century. From the time he left the farm in Fresno to go to Berkeley and start a grocery store in Albany, in Richmond. They followed him until he was senile, wearing diapers. Every year the FBI would write, in Fresno, would write the FBI in Washington and ask if they should continue to follow Arax. And he had, in these files, they blacked out most of everything. But the stuff that was there, I could glean the past. 2 FBI agents would show up all the time. They followed him to a Workers' Day picnic along the Kings River where he was the featured speaker. My grandfather was a speaker in demand. If you needed a eulogy and you were an Armenian, you called on Arax, and he went all over the state to deliver these eulogies for his comrades mostly. The FBI had followed him to this picnic where there was circle dancing going on. They reported this. And they said that Arax, before he gave the speech, had gone to the table and had bought a shish kebab sandwich. So this was the level of detail that the FBI used as they followed him. My other grandfather, the priest, was on the opposite end of the political. He was a nationalist. The party was called the Tashnad Parties. Extreme nationalists who didn't like the fact that Armenia was part of the Soviet Union. He wanted it to be independent. Arax was more a pragmatist. He was a hunchag, which was a lefty, and he believed that Armenia could only survive as part of the Soviet Union. And yet these two guys, these two titans would get together at our house for holidays, and they would say, Marky, would you go fix us a highball? I'm not even sure if I remember what a highball is now, but I fixed it, and they would sit and drink, and they had such a wonderful time. 2 men who loved their country, who had gone through the same trauma, had different visions of it, but could come together. People are trapped in history. History is trapped in them. James Baldwin, one of our great writers. And so I began this journey, 30 years, of trying to figure out my place. Keith, how much time do we have? Okay. I found, by driving up and down Highway 99 more than 1,000 times, I found these answers. I found my books. I found the story of California. I learned that this land, the valley, was a land of utter violence. Okay. That they had left the land of genocide and had come to a land of genocide. The remaking of the ground itself, of the earth, was a kind of violence never unleashed before in human history. Geologists will tell you that the San Joaquin Valley, my part of the valley, the most industrialized part of the valley, is the most altered landscape by human hand in human history. Rivers moved hundreds of miles. Rivers stopped cold. Land that was hilly, flattened by a plow, called the Fresno scraper. Rivers made to run backward by pumps. Marsh emptied, lakes emptied. Tulare Lake was the biggest body of fresh water west of the Mississippi. If you look at maps in it 150 years ago, it was the most dominant feature on the California map. 880 square miles, 4 distinct tribes of Yokuts lived along its shores. They fished the bottom. Okay? This was a lake where 5 rivers, the Kings, the Kuya, the Tule, and the Kern, emptied into this river. Emptied into this lowland. And it was a low lake, 20 feet deep at its most. It was so shallow that the Yokut women would fish the bottoms of this lake with their toes. Mussels, clams. It had been drained dry by Confederates from the South. After the gold rush, let's talk about violence, the melting of mountains to unearth gold. Well, when you commit that kind of violence to the ground, what kind of violence does it allow you to commit to the people of that ground? And so, tremendous remaking. The lake was drained dry, and these families that grew cotton in the South, chased out of the South by the boll weevil, came west and drained the rest of Tulare Lake dry and planted the richest cotton patch in the world. This is where I found a tribe of lost Black Okies when I was writing the book, The King of California. I was driving down 99 on a winter day, and I looked and I saw a shack off to the side of the road, and I thought, my goodness, this shack, tar paper, wood, it's still standing. And as I got closer, I could see out of the stovepipe in the roof of the shack that there were puffs of smoke coming out. I thought, oh my goodness, someone is living there. So I pulled off the road, crossed the railroad tracks, went up through a dirt road along a vineyard, and there I came up to this wood shack. And it was standing on stilts because this was the Tulare Lake bottom. And in spite of the contrivances of those farmers, in big, heavy snowman years, the lake would come back to life, and it could flood this shack. As I got up closer, I could see that there were cracks in the wood, and that there were furs and rabbits that had been put on the cracks to keep the wind from coming in. Someone was hunting rabbits, eating those rabbits, and then using the fur. And I looked close, and the roof was held up by these empty cans of Vienna sausage. I knocked on the door once, twice. There was an outhouse, a scattering of all sorts of oddments of decades of accumulation. It took a minute, and it creaked open. And there above me was a small black man. He looked ancient, and it turned out that he was 97, 98 years old, and his name was James Dixon. And he was nervous. He was talking in a stutter. He did talk in a stutter, but his stutter grew worse. He thought I was with the county, and I'd come to shut down his only place of living. And I said, no, I'm a writer. I said, what brought you to this place? He started telling me his story, and I said, are there others like you? And he said, across 99, there is the last of us still there. And I went across the road later that afternoon to a place called Teviston. And I found a whole community of elderly Black people living in a way that few others were. They had been locked out by racism and restrictive real estate codes from these small towns, and the only place they had was this alkali dust to plant their shacks. The alkali was so heavy that if you looked from afar, it looked like snow was on the ground. They lived there for years without electricity, without water. They brought in water by oil drum and milk pail. There was a story I found in the 1952-53 Time magazine. It was called The Gift. And it was a story of this community rallying, coming together, and bringing in water for the first time. And I found a woman in her 50s who remembered that day, remembered the first bath she took indoors. So, this is the kinds of stories I kept telling, finding hidden stories. And people ask me, what compels you? If not, what gives you the right to cross ethnic and racial lines and go and tell the story of others? An editor never asked me these questions, but I get asked these questions now. Yeah, people think maybe it's a form of cultural appropriation. And my answer is that I was there. I had a tape recorder, I asked for permission, and they gave me their stories. The Black Okies are all gone now. I have 200 hours of their oral histories. It's a rare story. This is the Great Migration, right? But these blacks did not go to the northern cities. They didn't go to Detroit or Chicago or New York. If they came west, they didn't go to LA or Oakland. They wanted to keep alive the rural. They went from the rural south and southwest to the rural west. And so I have these tapes. And I'd like to believe that a writer can go anywhere a writer wants to go. But there's an obligation when you cross into an area that is foreign to you, that you did not live this history. I mean, for a time, I was the Asian reporter at the LA Times. I documented the rise of suburban Chinatowns in San Gabriel Valley. I just felt comfortable doing this in part because in those restrictive real estate covenants, it said, no Negroes, no Mongolians, no Asiatics, no Mexicans, no Armenians, no lineal descendants of Armenians. The only way an Armenian and these other groups can be on in these suburbs called Fig Garden is if they were the help, the servants. So, this white boy felt comfortable crossing those lines. And it made for a pretty good career. So, do we have time for questions?
Yeah, we're going to, that's
Okay.
awesome.
So, thank you for allowing me to tell these stories. I had more, but we're going to get to answer some of those probably in the question. So thank you very much.
So what happens now, I was just reminded of this fact when I was talking to our undergraduates. None of them have been to or remember going to one of our great big lectures at the Menendez Shrem and so on, where we have this very unique style of questioning called the Commonwealth Club style. So what we'll do is, for a brief moment, Helena Zygmunt-Wagenhaupt, who is a professor at art and art history, who also teaches one of the largest human rights studies courses at UC Davis, Art, Architecture, and Human Rights, and is a recent recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship as well as Public Scholarship Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, will just engage Mark in a conversation. And while he's doing so, if you have a question, we have note cards, and we will bring you the note. So just raise your hand if you have a question. We will bring you a card with a pen, pencil, and then as they're talking, we will gather the cards and try to make sure that we can ask these questions. Often they're very similar questions, and I also like using the cards because some people aren't as comfortable standing up in front and asking a question, but they'll write it down. So please, if you have anything you'd like to pose to Mark, do so. Just get a card and we'll proceed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rick, for an amazing talk.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to share this stage with you, and gives me an opportunity to thank you publicly for being so generous and so supportive of writers. So I really appreciate all the advice you've given me over
We had a
the
good
years
talk
in
last night.
my
Watch your next one.
We did. So as we say in Armenian, to mystic shida hosing, let's sit crooked and talk straight. So while the people are thinking of their questions, I wanted to open a broad subject. You've been looking at the history of the landscape of California and the environment of California for decades. Long before the environmental movement became mainstream or something that had a lot of acceptance. And I wondered if you had any general observations to make about the way in which the activism, the environmental movement has transformed in the last couple of decades.
Yeah, I see it in Fresno. We have folks working in environmental justice that we never had before. There's a measure that we have that raises tons of tax money for new roads. In the past, the road money went for suburban sprawl, just went to line the pockets of the wealthiest white developers in town. Some of them Armenian, by the way. And now there's pushback. These folks have got themselves on these committees. They're advocating for rural communities that don't have adequate roads. There's a place called Huron, one of the poorest places in California, Mendota, where kids are crossing freeways to get to school, no crosswalks. And so a lot has happened. Climate change, obviously, there are questions whether fighting climate change is compatible with capitalism. But in California, we're doing things that other places aren't. And I think there is some hope here. I have a son who's waiting actually to hear from, he's a transfer student waiting to hear from Davis. He wants to come here and teach literature. And he's despairing. He despairs about climate change. He's despairing now about the war. And, I have to buck him up sometimes and tell him, listen, this just means you have to dig deeper. And there are people here in the valley now. It's weird that the San Joaquin Valley is different than your Sacramento Valley. Well, it's more civilized, let's put it that way.
The Sacramento Valley is more civilized.
Yes, oh yes. And we have to almost import an outside ethic. The more people come in from the outside, the more they are willing to tackle these things. The folks that grew up in Fresno, that went to school maybe at Fresno State or didn't go to school, their eyes are just kind of accustomed to seeing things that they see. And it's really depressing that nothing gets done except for these outside people who come in and say, no, this is not normal. Okay? We have been geographically exiled from the rest of California. And that geographical detachment means that we have this weird code. Same people. I can trace families, the wealthiest families in Fresno, and the sons, daughters are doing the same thing the grandfathers did. They're running the town. It's very much like a plantation. I'm slightly, painting with a broad brush here, but But yeah, so I think there's a lot of positive that's happening.
One of the things that I love about your writing about the environment, and especially your last book, The Dreamt Land, is when you talk about the destruction of the environment, the incredible ways in which humans have shaped this valley in unprecedented ways. You never separated from the communities that that are part of this change, that are destroying the environment and are being destroyed by it. And I wonder if you could talk about the range of communities that you have investigated as a journalist and as a writer. You talked about the incredible story of the Black Keys living on the side of Highway 99. I know that you've also interviewed and spent time with the communities who are involved in the almonds production that you alluded to at the beginning of the
You're talking about Stuart and Linda Resnick, the biggest
Yes.
farmers in California,
Yes.
and actually in the United States. Yeah, no, I found, it's weird, I found that I can't really remember a time when a door was slammed in my face saying, leave, I don't want to tell my story. Maybe once or twice. I think if you approach people in earnest, Gideon or Janet Malcolm might say that if you approach people and do your little song and dance and disguise your real intent and do a con job, you could get in the door. I never felt like I was doing a con job. Maybe it was a very sophisticated one. It didn't even occur to me. But I got in the door, and from the richest farmers to the people in the fields, they've told me their story, and it's a great privilege. You kind of insinuate yourself in these lives. This is how I told the story of the Boys of McFarland. I don't know if any of you have seen that movie. It was kind of inspired and stolen, that frankly, from me. Yeah, it happens. There's an episode. What's that thing? Billy Bob Thornton. It was what? No, it's just where the land is sinking and all this stuff's going on. It came out, and that was flat out. It's my own dialogue in there. They just take. So yeah, I think you just keep accumulating, keep finding yourself going into these places, and then you see that once you've kind of figured out the history, you can see how this stuff is part of that history. But I continue to be surprised and continue to discover new things. When the Hmong came to the valley, I documented that whole experience. Literally they came from the highlands of Laos, where they were slash and burn farmers. They came from the 17th century, and in a plane flight landed in the 21st century. And can I tell a funny story? It begins sad. A Hmong shaman was trying to save his wife, who had, I think, multiple sclerosis. And he tried the sacrifice of chickens and other animals. They didn't work, and so he needed to do something serious in his religion. And he ended up sacrificing a little German Shepherd puppy on the front steps. And this outraged all the neighbors. So I knocked on the door, and the son came. And I said, here, I'm doing a story. I want to understand your cultural practices. I knew there had been other conflicts, for years. White folks were saying that the Hmong were eating dogs. It was just crazy stuff that was going on. And he said, well, just give me a few minutes. My father's in the middle of a ceremony. And so he waited for his father to finish. I went in, sat down, and the father was still doing some ceremonial things. And there was a lot of smoke that was coming from a bong or something like that. And so I sat, and the son acting as translator, I got the whole story of why puppy dog. It didn't make it any less outrageous, I guess. It didn't make it any less of an offense to the sensibilities of all of us in the West. but at least it explained it. And this man was very polite, spent about an hour with me, and I took my notes. As I got up to leave, I kind of staggered. I was wobbling. And as we walked outside, I said, I'm not feeling so well. I said, what was that smoke? And he said, oh, that was opium. I don't know if you can get high from a contract like that. I don't know, but I something just, you know. And then he took me to the backyard and showed me where his father was growing the opium. Yeah, that's the kind of encounters.
So backyard farmers.
Yes, yes. I got to look at Grandpa's painting to see if there's some poppies there. I am just taking, she's taking a lot of liberties. You know, those may be poppies right there. Yeah.
So we are surrounded by human rights activists and scholars. So the question is, looking forward, what are some of the biggest environmental human rights challenges facing the Central Valley?
That's a great question. When we built this one-of-a-kind water delivery system that moves water from the north where it rains to the south where it doesn't rain, when we made California, the invention of it, and built a concrete river 444 miles long, we were about 13 million Californians. We're now 40 million. And we have these inherent swings in weather, right? We go from drought to flood. It's part of our DNA. But now hitching on to those wild swings in weather is climate change. And so we are seeing a kind of havoc that we've never seen before. Record wildfires. So the question becomes is how much bigger can California get when we're already up against that limit line? And what does that mean? Do we pull up the bridge and say no more new people can come here? That this is going to become a place of the privileged? It's a very difficult question. And yet when I went up to Paradise 4 months after that fire, I couldn't believe as I was driving from Chico up to Paradise, I was going along a road called the Skyway. And it was literally the Skyway. As you were driving it, you were seeing the sky. As I got closer, I could see that on one side of the road was a river canyon, and on the other side of the road was a river canyon. And here, on a geological chimney, County of Butte, with the state of California saying it's all right, had planted 40,000 people in the path of wildfire. So we have this question. I mean, how do we reinvent California to prevent those things from happening? I mean, even as we are going through these record summers, and let me tell you something. In the valley, for 3 months we lived with a deadly kind of wildfire smoke. I was inside all day with HEPA filters. But 10 million Californians, a quarter of our population, are living in the wildland-urban interface. It just can't continue. Where are we going to put these folks? How are we going to portion the water? Do we pave over the San Joaquin Valley and turn it into another San Fernando Valley? Oh, I hope not. And yet, we've got hedge funds and pension funds and the Canadian Royal Mounties coming in and buying huge swaths of farmland for the water. The Mormon Church. So this is what's happening in the valley. And we have to have this conversation. We have to have it fast. And I think it becomes an issue, too, of the new people that come here. How we integrate them. How we provide the kind of housing and other things that we need to do in a way that still girds us for climate change.
That is both welcoming and fair to the environment and to existing communities.
That's right.
Yeah, not easy.
No, it's,
There's a couple of questions about the Great Migration to California. So one question is, what will you do with the information gathered from the Tennyson residents? And somewhat related, thank you for your presentation. I'm looking at a book about the Black presence in the Central Valley. I'm calling it the Black Valley. I'm working on a book.
What is that? That's
This
a Milman.
is- It's Professor Buehler Harrison. Milman writes, where can I access the oral histories of the Black Okies you mentioned? Are they publicly available to researchers and teachers? I would love to gain access to that, and I'm sure our archivists and librarians would love to help you with that. I'd also seen the photos of Senes.
Ernest Lowe, that's right, he's on our website. Yeah. And Matt Black, who's extraordinary document.
And so Professor Harrison is asking about the possibilities of exhibitions, photographs of cotton workers. So, yeah.
So I have about 800 hours of oral histories. And Black Okies, Hmong, White Okies, Latinos, most of the people are gone. Armenians, I've just documented all this stuff. I went through with this little, Sony cassette recorder and just filled up all this. And the tapes are starting to degrade a little bit. I started a website called the West of West website, and we have digitized about 70 hours. I'm talking to Stanford University, which is interested in digitizing them. The problem is I'm going out to do an interview, and all of a sudden you hear me playing music, or I'm arguing with my wife, who's now my ex-wife. And I just can't have this stuff as part of history. So I've got to have some folks. So I applied for this grant. It was a clear grant for these undiscovered kinds of historical archives. And I came close, but I didn't get it. I'm trying to raise funds for folks to go through them, take out the things that are extraneous, and then stitch it all together and put it on the West of West website, all of it. It's invaluable. Stanford is not willing to do that. They're just willing to digitize it all and then keep the original. They will allow my West of West to use it. So this is what I'm trying to do right now, as I'm trying to write a book about the same thing. I'm going to tell my next book that's mine is going to be about the Black Okies and stuff. And I will turn it into, I'm going to use fiction and nonfiction, kind of blend it. So that's the state of those things. And I'm trying to, I've even talked to some folks at UC Davis who have talked about maybe bringing that collection in the West of West Center here. I just haven't, I've been so busy writing something else, so I haven't been able to pursue it like I should. And meanwhile, there's this dust and guilt accumulating as these tapes are starting to degrade a little bit. But it's extraordinary history. I didn't even realize I was collecting it, but it was that 15-year-old boy trying to find answers to his dad's murder, and I just kept on. So I'd love to talk, we'll talk. Really
Definitely, you guys need to have a conversation. So there's a wonderful question about the stories of indigenous people of California. You mentioned the tribes that were around the lake. How has their history shaped your work and understanding of the valley?
I've written about the indigenous story in each of my books. I think in part because we were called Fresno Indians and I couldn't figure out what the hell the connection was. But in The King of California, I wrote about it, and I went back and read those chapters that I wrote on the indigenous. And there's some things in there that make me wince a little bit. But it was written in 2003 or 4, 20 years ago, and it's pretty good. I mean, in terms of, it's not like I'm embarrassed of something or I'm showing, blind spots. I think I get the history down pretty well. And so in each of the books, I try to tell the story. In the Dreamland, my editor, it was a 3-pound book, and it is a 3-pound book. And my editor in the East Coast said, as you're going back to California's past, its extraction, can we just start with the gold rush? And I said, that's an obvious place. And I said, first of all, you have to understand that the first taking of a resource in California was the taking of the body of the indigenous. by taking that body, the Spanish missions were able to take the first flow of rivers, build the first crude dams and ditches. So no, I can't do that. So I just tried to write it as lively as I could. And I tried to bring myself into it. I went to Tenaya Junior High School. We played Awani and Tioga, Yosemite and Sequoia. No one ever taught me who Tenaya was. In the Dreamland, I finally answered the question. Tenaya was the great chief of the Awanachee people, the Awanis. He had been ripped from his homeland in Yosemite, taken out, his son murdered before him. And he utters a chant, a kind of death curse against the white man, that when you read it in that book, it'll put chills down your spine. So it took me 30 years to figure out that I went to a junior high school named after the chief of the Awanachee. Go figure.
Yes, and as a descendant of genocide survivors, you go to a high school named after a person upon whom a genocide was perpetrated.
Right. Indigenous, I mean, we were indigenous, they're indigenous.
And so this is a question that I think will really speak to you. And so the person says, you mentioned despair. Many young people today naturally feel heavy despair. But those of us who want to have hope are often sidelined as ignorant and naive by both young and old. I'm sure you have encountered this. So how do you deal with this?
I think some of the great things, contributions in our world, music, art, writing, it's been done by people who are very naive. You know, someone who thinks that whatever they're putting down is going to reach somebody. Maybe, possibly, if they get it right, move somebody. Maybe if they get it really right, move enough people that something, change happens. Naivete is, it's a wonderful gift. You want, the cynicism will come. But I think, don't let anybody beat you down with those kinds of accusations. You're doing what has to be done, what we failed to do. And you just go. You just go and do it. That's my message to my son, the youngest. You know, COVID came right in the middle of all this question. He said, you know, it's been tough. But he's worked his way during the pandemic through all the Russians, the Irish. He's worked his way through the classics. He's just reading, you know, so naive.
Stay naive, everyone. Thank you so much, Mark.
So I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank Mark and Eleanor. Another round of applause for them, please. We are now invited to a cookie and coffee reception in a mask-free external place. So please go ahead and join us there. Mark will be there. Other members of the Human Rights Studies program and so will be there as well. We encourage you to ask questions and talk with us. We'd love to host you. Thank you so much. And again, be courageous, be naive, and we'll proceed. Bye.